The excuse me. The title this morning was Thomas Jefferson a hero or a monster? The answer is, in fact, yes. But if we want to see what makes America tick, at least when we're at our best, we can look at the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. Our Constitution is a blueprint for a government and legal system based on our ideals, but the Declaration of Independence is where those ideals are stated, but it has no standing in law. In the real world, there usually is a gap between the way we want to be and the way we really are. And one crucial task of covenantal religion, this religion, is to look honestly at that gap. And that's what this sermon is really about. As school children learn, the Declaration of Independence was written mostly by Thomas Jefferson, and he was a brilliant mind, an architect, an eminent scientist, a political and moral philosopher, and a statesman. And in writing the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson adapted ideas on freedom and self-government from philosophers and political theorists, as well as statements already issued by the Continental Congress. Other members of the drafting committee added their suggestions as well, and Jefferson combined all these thoughts into the short, powerful document we have today. But of course, he phrased it according to the gendered assumptions of his time. We hold that all men are created equal. All men, meaning all persons, we're told. But looking at the laws of that day, the so-called founding fathers really were mostly talking about educated white men like themselves. Women were not seen as equal. People of non-European descent were seen as even less equal. For 250 years, we've tried to live into words which even then had one meaning on the surface and a different meaning underneath. And the struggle has been to unify the Declaration of Independence's message of freedom and equality, trying to make it mean what it says on all levels, because in fact it did not in Jefferson's day. And that's the gift and challenge, isn't it? The Declaration aspires so powerfully to a better world, it makes us want to go there. It lifts up how things ought to be, even though that's never been the way things actually were. Bless our hearts. We've made enough progress to make some privileged folks nervous in our own day, so there is that. This tension was apparent to some people right from the beginning. One acid-tongued English abolitionist, Thomas Day, wrote, quote, "If there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is the American patriot, signing resolutions of independency with one hand while with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves." Close quote. And of course, Jefferson was one of those whip-brandishing slave owners. So were George Washington, Patrick Henry, James Madison, and other founders. And Jefferson saw that tension himself. He disliked slavery, he said, and talked about freeing his enslaved workers. But he never got around to that. And in fact, in his first draft of the Declaration, he actually blamed slavery on England and King George III, accusing the king of, quote, "waging cruel war against human nature itself by authorizing the capture and transport of slaves." Jefferson basically suggesting that England had forced slavery upon the colonies against our will. That paragraph got thrown out, but the congregation of the Continental Congress didn't vote it out because of its hypocrisy. They voted it out because southern states refused to include a negative word about slavery. Again, the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness applied pretty much just to property-owning white males. And sadly, there still seem to be people who would like to go back to that interpretation. As for Thomas Jefferson himself, he was brilliant, but he was just as complex and multi-layered as he was brilliant. One of the most thoughtful and early historians to write about his complexities was a Mormon woman from Utah, Fawn McKay Brody, in the 1960s and 70s. Fawn Brody made a career of writing history that male scholars had preferred to gloss over. She got her start with a remarkable biography of Mormon church founder Joseph Smith. She was born into a prominent Mormon family, the McKays. Her uncle, David O. McKay, was a long-serving, beloved Mormon church president. Working on her biography of Joseph Smith, she used her standing as a McKay to gain access to highly classified church archives, and she did not shrink from what she found there. Mormon historians, all male, had written sanitized accounts of Joseph Smith. In reading Smith's own letters and records, though, Brody found that he was not the saintly figure they made him out to be. She found him to be good-natured and charismatic, but also rather lazy, manipulative, and a con artist. She concluded that Joseph Smith founded Mormonism as an intentional swindle and then gradually talked himself into believing his own claims. And in the process, by Brody's best estimate, he also talked more than 80 women into marrying him. Church fathers brought her up on a charge of apostasy for writing that book and excommunicated her. But I mention that because she brought that same stark honesty to her study of Thomas Jefferson. Historians had studied Jefferson for ages, so there didn't seem to be many new ways to approach him as a subject, but Brody focused on aspects they neglected: Jefferson's emotional life and an honest look at his real conduct around slavery. As a young man, Thomas Jefferson argued against slave trading and even called for complete abolition. But he grew older, got married, and when his father-in-law, John Wales, died, Jefferson and his wife, Martha, still accepted 135 enslaved workers left to them in Wales's will. That was extremely valuable property in 18th century Virginia. To be frank, it does seem to be easier to free slaves when they're someone else's slaves, not your own. And Fawn Brody looked hard at this. She was the first historian to do a serious study of Jefferson's long affair with his enslaved servant, Sally Hemmings. Male historians long poo-pooed this issue, accusing, and even after Brody's book came out, she accused it of being, as they put it, overly speculative. But to Brody, the Sally Hemmings affair helped explain, in part, Jefferson's failure to free his slaves. In Virginia, freed slaves had to leave the state, and it made sense to Brody that Jefferson would not free his slaves if it meant his longtime mistress had to leave also. However much Jefferson said he cared about his slaves, they remained enslaved, almost all of them. One enslaved worker they got from John Wales when he died was named Betty Hemmings. Her father had been the captain of the slave ship that transported her mother from Africa. So she was half Caucasian. Because she was light-skinned, John Wales took her as his mistress. They had 12 children together. Remember, these would be half-siblings to Jefferson's wife, Martha. And when Wales died, the Jeffersons gave Betty Hemmings a cabin of her own, and she became Martha's personal servant. One of her daughters, by Wales, was named Sally, an attractive girl who was three-quarters white. But even though she was mostly white and Thomas Jefferson's half-sister-in-law, she was still 100% enslaved. They owned her. By the standards of the day, she had to obey every command or be punished or even sold away from the family she knew. Now that, in my mind, is a pretty fiendish choice. It's no choice at all. But even though slaveholders hardly ever talked about this sort of thing, it seemed to be a pretty common situation at the time. By all accounts, Jefferson was genuinely devoted to his wife, Martha. He was miserable any time he was away from her, including the time he spent with the Continental Congress writing the Declaration of Independence. But in 1782, Martha Jefferson fell ill. After giving birth to their sixth child, she lay near death for weeks, and Jefferson was beside himself. To make things even worse, he was Virginia's outgoing governor at the time and had been just been elected to the state legislature. His presence in the state capitol was important enough, and the legislature apparently insensitive enough, they threatened to have him arrested and dragged there by force. And still he refused to go, and finally in September 1782, Martha Jefferson died. Jefferson was at her bedside, and her dying request was that he never marry again. Jefferson became depressed with migraine headaches. You don't usually hear the standard studies of Jefferson talking about the migraines. Just thought I'd mention that. Made it impossible for him to travel or take part in government. It took him a year to recover. He was ambitious, though, and when he did feel better, he ran for Congress, he was elected, and a year after that, he became our ambassador to France. In Paris, Jefferson was still lonely with human feelings and needs. He was introduced to an artist named Maria Cosway, who was attractive but married. Jefferson was smitten. And they entered into a flirtatious relationship. Historians doubt they had an actual affair. She was married, and she was also deathly afraid of becoming pregnant, even by her husband. But she saved Jefferson's letters, which show how infatuated he was. One of the most famous is called A Dialogue Between Head and Heart. And he had to write that one with his left hand because he was rushing so hard to meet her one day, he tripped, fell, and broke his right hand. His heart was winning at that point. Their romance faded after a couple of years. Jefferson apparently took his wife's request not to remarry very seriously. As male historians put it, after the Causeway romance, he, quote, devoted himself to a life of the mind. But in 1787, his 8-year-old daughter, Polly, came to live with him in Paris, bringing her enslaved maid, Sally Hemmings. Sally was no more than 15 years old at the time, possibly as young as 13. And it seems to me that what we have here is about as good an illustration of human perversity as it's possible to get. On the one hand, many of our founders looked on people of color as beneath talk about human rights. But all that got compartmentalized as Jefferson's daughter's maid became Jefferson's outlet for his libido, without apparently interfering with that life of the mind. that historians like to talk about with Jefferson. She was light-skinned, beautiful, and his dead wife's half-sister. By 1789, when he was recalled to the United States, she was pregnant. French law did not recognize slave ownership. In fact, Jefferson paid wages to his enslaved servants while they were in Paris. And Sally Hemmings could, in theory, have petitioned to remain in France as a free woman. And according to her brother, James Hemmings, she threatened to do exactly that. But then again, what does a pregnant single teenager do alone in a foreign capital? According to James Hemmings, Jefferson persuaded her to return to the United States by promising to free her and her child later. So, Sally returned to Jefferson's plantations. Years passed, and Jefferson died without ever freeing more than a handful of his enslaved workers. For what it's worth, that was pretty typical, no matter what the more idealistic slave owners promised. Another example, for financial reasons, James and Dolly Madison never freed their slaves either, despite written intentions to do so. George Washington did free his when he died, but his wife Martha owned most of their enslaved workers, and she kept them. Over the years, by Fawn Brody's estimate, Sally Hemmings bore Jefferson a half-dozen children, and all but 2 lived and died in slavery. Again, most historians rejected Brody's conclusions when her book first came out. Jefferson's white descendants hotly rejected them. But in 1998, DNA testing confirmed that Sally Hemings' descendants shared Jefferson's DNA, and Brody's research was vindicated. But before we get self-righteous, American culture in 2026 is not the best place to pass judgment on Thomas Jefferson. In our own day, we still see billionaires and government officials getting away with sex crimes against underage girls, just like Sally Hemings. Denial of unpleasant facts seems to be about as natural to the human condition as breathing. And we need to remember that when we look back at Jefferson's age, and we need to be humble about what still goes on in our own time. On the one hand, I have no doubt that by his own lights, Jefferson was doing the best he could. He achieved great things during his presidency, including, for example, the Louisiana Purchase and exploration of vast tracts of the North American wilderness. On the other hand, we have at least come far enough to understand that his relationship with Sally Hemings was unethical and criminal on multiple levels. And, of course, as for the Louisiana Purchase, it ultimately resulted in the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous inhabitants there. And we ourselves benefit from those crimes to this day. I'll put it this way. Thomas Jefferson did act monstrously because he lived in a monstrous culture. A person of color in the United States in 1800 was faced with all kinds of monstrous practices. So were women. We have made progress. We need to keep making progress. The Sally Hemings affair became a scandal when Jefferson ran for president. His household servants were remarkably light-skinned and looked a lot like him. And his political rivals had plenty to say about that. But he got away with it, same as politicians and businessmen today get away with being on the so-called Epstein list. Precious little has happened there. throughout the South. Actually, that was seen as rather a boys will be boys, dirty little behind-the-scenes tradition that continued well into the 20th century. White men fathering children on young black women. And as the goings on at Epstein's Island illustrate, we still have a lot of ways to declare someone a non-person. Skin color, poverty, gender. But crimes against non-persons still beg to be witnessed, and too many people still turn their heads and pretend not to see. When he died, Thomas Jefferson left, give or take, approximately 50,000 pages of writings. None of them even mention Sally Hemmings. She does show up a few times in the plantation's business records, and that's it, usually when she's giving birth. And to me, that suggests that she probably meant little to him other than as an outlet for his sexual needs. To be brutally frank, it was apparently more respectable to rape a slave than to visit a prostitute. Sally Hemmings was in her 50s when Jefferson died, and I doubt either of them could have foreseen that an ingenious woman historian would uncover their relationship 150 years later. And they never even dreamed that it would be confirmed by DNA tests. No one back then dreamed DNA even existed. Which brings us to the side of human affairs that deals with the power of creativity itself. Jefferson did aspire genuinely to a better world. In writing the Declaration of Independence, his reach definitely exceeded his grasp. But really, it still exceeds our grasp as well. And this is how creativity works in a religious sense. And it's also a place for faith in the human spirit despite all our faults and flaws, for all his self-delusion around race, and despite very real crimes that people of his time failed to recognize as criminal at the time, Jefferson, like our chalice this morning, did try to shine a light toward a future beyond his own imagination. And in that future, we can now begin to see and understand things that Jefferson couldn't see and didn't understand. Our union is still far from perfect. It gets frustrating, but courageous people are still following that beam of light that his generation created. Never underestimate the creative, world-changing power of people genuinely reaching towards something better, even if they don't know how, even if they don't even understand it themselves. Never underestimate the power of aspiration, even when the person doing it is criminally flawed. There's a long discussion to be had there. We're still working on the Declaration of Independence, all persons are created equal line. This coming Independence Day and always, we need to keep trying to live into what those words really mean, and also what they might someday mean that we don't yet even understand. Blessed be, and amen. Appreciate it.